My name is Vivian Calloway, and I am 63 years old. I want to tell you about the most honest thing I have ever said in my life. It was 3 words long. It was not a confession. It was not an accusation. It was not a speech I had rehearsed or a line I had practiced in the mirror on a sleepless night. It was the simple, quiet, unremarkable truth, and it detonated 40 years of arrangement like a lit match dropped in dry grass. The 3 words were, I don't know. I said them at the dining room table of my cousin Patrice's house on a Sunday in September. I was 62 years old at the time. The tablecloth was the yellow one with the embroidered edges that Patrice had bought in Portugal 20 years ago and only brought out for the family dinners she considered important. My sister Delia was sitting 6 chairs away. The question had been directed at me. The answer I had given every previous time was a different one entirely. But this time I said, I don't know. And I meant it. Delia is my younger sister by 7 years. She is 56 and she has been, by any reasonable accounting, one of the most charming people I have ever known. I say this without bitterness. I say it because it is true, and because I think you need to understand it before you understand anything else. Charm is not nothing. Charm is not the same as a good heart, but it is not nothing either. Delia has a laugh that fills a room. She remembers people's birthdays. She sends flowers when someone's mother dies. She makes everything feel slightly warmer and slightly more significant than it actually is, and people who know her love her without quite being able to explain why. She also lies. Not constantly. Not dramatically. She lies the way some people rearrange furniture. To make the room feel better, to put the best face on things, to manage the impression without examining the substance. She tells people she was running late when she didn't show up. She tells people she forgot when she chose. She tells people the version of events that casts her in the most forgivable light, and she does it so fluently and so warmly that most people don't notice the seam between what happened and what she says happened. I noticed. I had always noticed. I noticed when I was 19 and she was 12 and she told our mother she hadn't eaten the last of the shortbread when she had, and I watched our mother believe her, and I watched Delia's face and saw not shame but relief, the pure, operational relief of a version that held. I noticed all the way through. I noticed every time. And I covered for her. I covered because she was younger, and I was older, and that is how it was in our family. I covered because our mother was fragile after our father left in 1984, and keeping things smooth was a form of love that I had learned so young I could no longer locate its beginning. I covered because Delia would look at me after she'd told the story and I'd confirmed it or stayed quiet, and her gratitude was a thing I could feel in the room, real and warm, and I was lonely enough and tired enough and used to enough of being the competent one who didn't need anything that her gratitude filled a space I hadn't fully named. That is the mechanism. I want to be precise about it. I covered not only from obligation. I covered because I was getting something back. The something was thin and had no nutritional value, but I was getting it. Delia's lying came from fear. I understand that now in a way I couldn't when I was 26 and first starting to register the pattern clearly. Our mother's love had been, for most of our childhoods, conditional on a specific kind of performance, on being pleasant, on not making waves, on presenting a face to the world that made our family look intact when it was not. Delia had internalized this as an operating system. When her reality didn't match the required performance, she edited her reality. Not because she was cruel or calculating. Because the alternative, being seen as imperfect, as failing, as not matching the face, was the thing she feared most in the world. She passed some of this to me in a different form. I didn't learn to lie. I learned to smooth. I learned to manage. I learned to be the person who held the container so that Delia's version of events could exist inside it without breaking. 40 years is a long time to hold a container. The crack had been forming for years. The spring before the dinner at Patrice's house, Delia had asked me to confirm a story for her, a story about why she hadn't been at our aunt's hospital bedside in the final days, a story that was untrue and that several family members had started to question. She had called me on a Tuesday morning, her voice bright and certain, and she had said, "You owe me this. You always come through." I said nothing for a long moment. Then I said, I'll see what I can do. I hung up. I sat at my kitchen table with my tea, Earl Grey, loose leaf, in the green ceramic pot my daughter Marin had given me for my 60th birthday, and I thought about what she'd said. You owe me this. Not, please. Not, I know this is asking a lot. Not, thank you for all the times before. Just, you owe me this. As if 40 years of covering had produced not gratitude, but debt. As if all the smoothing and all the confirming and all the staying quiet had created not closeness between us but entitlement in her. I thought about that for a long time. The dinner at Patrice's house was in September. It was the kind of family gathering that happens after someone difficult dies. Our Aunt Rosa had passed in July, and the family had not fully converged since the funeral, and Patrice had decided that what was needed was a Sunday dinner with the people who remained and a chance to close the summer properly. There were 14 of us. Patrice and her husband Gord. My daughter Marin, who had driven up from the city with her partner Theo. My cousin Raymond and his wife, whose name I always confuse with her sister's because they sound too similar, and I have never admitted this to anyone.
Delia.
Delia's daughter Cassie. Several others I will compress for the sake of not losing you. The question came from Raymond. Raymond is the family historian in the way that certain people become family historians. By being curious, by asking questions, by caring about what actually happened rather than what was said to have happened. He had been piecing together, for several months, the story of our Aunt Rosa's final weeks, who had been there, who had not, what had happened between her and certain family members, whether the things she'd said near the end were as sharp as people had reported. He had been told by Delia that Delia had visited the hospital regularly in the last 2 weeks. He had asked me, once before, whether I could confirm this. On that occasion, 3 months earlier, I had said something vague, something about not being able to speak to what I didn't witness directly, something that didn't confirm and didn't deny and satisfied no one, least of all me. It had bought time. It had not answered the question. At Patrice's dinner table, with the yellow tablecloth and the lamb roast and 14 people and the particular Sunday evening light of early September, Raymond asked me again. Directly.
Clearly.
He said, Vivian, I just want to get the record straight. Do you know if Delia was at the hospital those last 2 weeks? Everyone at the table was involved in another conversation. No one else heard. It was just Raymond and me, quiet across the length of a long table. Delia was 6 chairs away. She was talking to Cassie. She did not look up. I had my answer ready. I had the version I always had ready, the smooth one, the manageable one, the one that confirmed without quite confirming, the one that had kept the container intact for 4 decades. I opened my mouth, and I said, I don't know. Raymond blinked. He said, You don't know? I said, I wasn't there. I can't speak to what I didn't see. Raymond nodded slowly. He said, Right, and made a small note in the small notebook he always carries, the navy one with the elastic closure, and then someone on his other side said his name, and he turned away, and I picked up my fork, and I ate a piece of lamb. 6 chairs away, Delia was still talking to Cassie. She had not heard.
Not yet.
The dinner ended at 8:30. People put on coats. There were the usual delays, the forgetting of things, the extra rounds of goodbye, the conversations that restart near the door. Marin found me in the kitchen while I was helping Patrice stack the plates, and she put her hand briefly on my arm and said, You okay, Mum? I said, Yes. I'm just tired. She looked at me for a moment. She knows me well enough to know there are different kinds of tired. She said, Drive safe, and went to find Theo. I drove home. I unlocked my own front door. I sat in the chair by the window, the green velvet one with the armrests that had gone soft from years of use, and I waited. It took 4 days for Delia to find out what I had said. The 4 days before Delia called were not quiet in the way that peace is quiet. They were quiet in the way that the hour before a storm is quiet. There is too much air. The birds have gone somewhere. You know that the thing has been set in motion, and you are simply waiting for the shape of it to arrive. I went about my week. I did not call Delia. I did not call Raymond to ask what he had done with the information. I did not call Patrice to debrief. These are things I might have done in previous years, manage the aftermath, gotten ahead of whatever was developing, stayed in the position of the person who had information and could smooth with it. This time I did none of that. I went to work. I supervised the 2 reading groups at the Millbrook Branch Library on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. I had lunch with my colleague Van Dryden on Wednesday, who is 3 years younger than me and has the dry good humor of someone who has decided that things are mostly funny, if you look at them right. I bought groceries. I refilled my Earl Grey tin at the shop on Cedar Street. I called Marin on Friday evening and talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular. I did not think about Delia's face when she found out what I had said. I allowed myself not to think about it. That was the first new thing I had done in 40 years. I gave myself permission to not pre-manage someone else's feelings about something true. On the 4th day, a Thursday, my phone rang at 6:18 p.m. The name on the screen was Delia's. I answered on the second ring. She said, before I could say anything, "I just got off the phone with Raymond." I said, "Okay." "He told me what you said. At Patrice's." I said I didn't know whether you'd been at the hospital. Because I didn't. There was a pause. When Delia paused, I had learned over a lifetime, it meant she was selecting. Not thinking, selecting. Choosing which register to enter. Wounded, or sharp, or the one that bypassed the argument entirely and went straight to the terms of the relationship. She said, "That's not what you said. You said you didn't know, and that phrasing is manipulative. You knew what it would imply." I said I didn't witness it. I said I couldn't speak to what I didn't see. Both of those things are true. Vivian. Her voice dropped. I needed you to cover for me on that one. It was one time. I didn't get to say goodbye properly, and that story, if it gets out that I wasn't there. Then you could tell people the truth about why. I said. That you had a hard time with illness. That you were frightened. People would understand that. You don't know what they'd understand. Maybe not, I said. But I don't know the story you asked me to confirm, either. And I'm not going to confirm things I don't know. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said it. "This is so manipulative of you." I said, "I just told the truth. By omission." "You told the truth by omission, and you knew exactly what it would do." I said, "I told Raymond I couldn't speak to what I didn't see. That's all I did." She said, "After 40 years. After everything." I said, "Yes." The call ended shortly after that. Not dramatically. No slammed phones, no final declarations. Just an end, a sentence that ran out of anywhere to go, and then the click of disconnection, and then the silence of my own living room, which felt, in the aftermath, both exactly the same as it always had, and completely different. The silence that followed lasted 9 days. 9 days in which Delia did not call, and I did not call, and neither of us sent a message. 9 days in which I learned, by degrees, what it felt like to not be managing anything. I had been managing since I was 19. I had been the one who held things together, smoothed things over, confirmed things that needed confirming, and buried things that needed burying. 9 days of doing none of that was the longest vacation I had taken for myself. In 4 decades. It was not comfortable.
I want to be honest about that.
On the 5th day, a Tuesday, Marin called. It was 9:22 p.m. I was sitting in the green velvet chair with my tea, and a book I had been pretending to read for 3 days. Marin said, "I heard from Aunt Delia." I set the book down. "She called you?"
I said.
She texted. She said you'd had a falling out and she was hurt, and she wanted me to know her side. I sat with that for a moment. The way it settled in me was not anger, exactly. It was closer to recognition, the familiar shape of a pattern I knew from childhood, the triangulating move, the managed narrative sent to the next generation audience. And I said, and I told her I'd heard your side too, and I wasn't going to be in the middle. Marin paused. "Mom, how long has this been going on?" I thought about how to answer that. The truthful answer was, "Longer than you've been alive." The answerable answer was, "A while." What I said was, "A long time, love." Marin said carefully, "Did you ever want to stop before?" I held the phone in my lap and looked at the lamp across the room, the one with the green glass shade my mother had left me. It had been my mother's for 30 years before it was mine. Yes, I said. I just didn't know what would happen. And now? I still don't, I said. But I know what was happening before. And I think what was happening before was worse. There was a long pause on the line. Not Marin selecting a register, just Marin, my daughter who is 34 and wiser than I was at her age by a considerable margin, sitting with what I'd said. Then she said, "Okay. I love you." I said, "I love you too." After I hung up, I sat for a while without moving. The lamp's green glass was the exact color of the cardigan my mother used to wear in the evenings when I was young, the soft green one she put on after dinner when the day was done. I had not thought about that cardigan in years. It arrived in my mind now, attached to nothing, asking nothing, just there a remnant of a much longer story about women in my family who had smoothed and covered and managed and called it love. I thought about whether what I was doing now was brave or just late. I thought perhaps it is both. Raymond called on day 7. He had a voice that I had always found reliable, unhurried, careful, the voice of a man who became a family historian because he genuinely wanted to know what happened. He said, "I want to apologize if asking that question at dinner caused you trouble." I said, "It didn't cause me trouble. It gave me an occasion." He paused. "An occasion for what?" "For telling the truth," I said, which I had not been doing on this particular subject for a long time. Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I appreciate that. I know that wasn't easy." "It was easier than I expected," I said. And harder in the aftermath than I expected." He said, "That usually seems to be how it goes." We talked for 20 minutes. He told me what he was putting together about Aunt Rose's final weeks, not to build a case against anyone, but because he believed, as family historians do, that the real story is always more interesting and more true than the protected version, and that families who carry false versions of events into the future pay a cost that compounds. I said I thought he was right. I said I thought I had been part of that cost for a long time without fully accounting for it. He said, "You're accounting for it now." I drove to my daughter's apartment the following Saturday, 3 hours south, a drive I had made so many times I navigated the highway interchanges without thinking. I brought a bottle of wine, and the batch of lavender shortbread I made every October from the recipe my mother had taught me, the one with the real butter, and the exact quarter teaspoon of dried lavender that she had measured with the small silver spoon that I now kept in the drawer with the other things I had kept from her kitchen. Marin opened the door. Theo was in the kitchen. We ate the shortbread with tea and talked about ordinary things for 2 hours, and it was the best 2 hours I had spent in several months. Before I left, Marin said, "Have you heard from her?" I said, "Not yet." She said, "Are you okay with that?" I thought about it. I said, "I'm working on being okay with it." She hugged me at the door. She is taller than me by 2 inches and she has her father's shoulders, and when she hugs me it is the hug of someone who has decided to love you without managing you, which is not the hug I grew up with. I drove home in the dark on the highway I knew by memory, and I thought, this is also what I was protecting. The chance to be real in the room with people I love. 40 years of covering for Delia had cost me something in my own house, had trained me to manage rather than be present, to confirm rather than say what I actually knew. The bill for that was not only Delia's. Some of it was mine. Delia called at 2:04 a.m. on the 9th day. I was not asleep. I had gone to bed at 11 but had been lying in the particular not quite dark of a bedroom at 2 in the morning, listening to the refrigerator hum and the house settle, thinking about nothing specific and everything general. When the phone lit up on the bedside table, I saw her name and I was not surprised. I answered. She was crying. Not the performing crying that I recognized from our childhood, the strategic crying that preceded a request. This was different. This was the crying of someone who had run out of moves. She said, "I don't know what to do." I said, "About what?" "Raymond, he's going to tell the family that I wasn't there. He's going to tell everyone." "He might," I said. "Or he might just record it accurately and not broadcast it. Raymond isn't punitive. But people will know." "Yes," I said. "They probably will." She cried for a moment. Then she said, I should have been there. I know I should have been there. I waited. I was afraid, she said. I couldn't. She looked so small in that bed, and I kept telling myself I'd go the next day, and then I didn't. And then it was too late. I know, I said. You knew. I know you well enough, I said. A long pause. The refrigerator hummed. Outside there was a car passing, its lights sliding across the ceiling. She said, Why didn't you cover for me? Just this once. I had been waiting for this question. I had not prepared an answer because I didn't think prepared answers were going to be useful. I just said what was true. I said, Because you told me I owed you. And when I heard that, the way you said it, like it was a debt, like 40 years of helping you added up to something you were entitled to collect, I understood something that I hadn't let myself understand before. She said, What? That I'd been covering for you all this time partly because I needed you to need me, and partly because I was afraid of what would happen if I stopped, and that those are not good reasons. Those are my reasons, not yours, and they're not enough. Delia was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I thought she might have put the phone down. But then she said, I didn't know you felt obligated. I didn't either, I said. Not clearly. Not until you said you owe me. Another silence. She said, I've been calling because I needed you to fix this. I know, I said. And you're not going to. No, I said. But I'll tell you what I'll do. If the family asks me directly what I know, I'll say what I know, and I'll say it without flourish. Not to hurt you. Just because I'm 63 years old, and I'm tired of managing the distance between what happened and what we say happened. I'll say it plainly, and I'll let people have their own reactions. She said, That terrifies me. I know, I said. But the other version terrified me. You just couldn't see it. We stayed on the phone for another 30 minutes. She didn't ask me to fix anything else. I didn't offer. When we said goodbye, it was not warm exactly. It was not the goodbye of people who had resolved something and were standing on the other side of it. It was the goodbye of people who had finally, after 40 years, had a conversation instead of a performance. The family didn't explode. I want to be clear about that because I think for a long time, the fear of the family exploding was one of the things that had kept me in my role. I had imagined, not in detailed, conscious terms, but in the vague catastrophizing way of someone who has managed stability for so long she can no longer distinguish between genuine risk and invented fear, that if the version of events cracked, something irreparable would happen. People would choose sides. Alliances would fracture. The family, such as it was, would not survive the introduction of truth into it. What actually happened was less dramatic and more permanent. Raymond put together a written account of Aunt Rosa's final weeks, partly from his own records, partly from interviews with the people who had been there. He shared it with the immediate family the following month, framed as a record rather than an indictment, and he included the fact that Delia had not visited in the final days along with the acknowledgement that the reasons for this were between Delia and her own conscience, not the family's property to adjudicate. He was precise, and he was fair, and he was the kind of historian that facts deserved. The family's reaction, distributed across a series of phone calls and messages over the following 2 weeks, was mostly quiet. There was some disappointment. Our cousin Patrice called me and said she wished she had known, not to judge Delia, but because she would have wanted someone to sit with Rosa, who wasn't a stranger. There was some sadness. There was, from our cousin Bernard, who had never trusted the polished surface of anything and who had long suspected that the family narrative was maintained by a few reliable people at significant personal cost, a message to me that said simply, I always thought you were holding more than you were showing. I'm glad you're not doing it anymore. I kept that message. It's still on my phone. Delia and I did not speak for 6 weeks after the 2 a.m. call. That was not a chosen distance. It was just the natural arc of two people who had operated in a certain configuration for 40 years trying to work out how to operate in a different one. The calls we did have during those 6 weeks were shorter than they had been for most of our adult lives. She told me about things she was doing. I told her about things I was doing. We did not manage each other. We did not debrief. We did not call each other after family events to compare notes and align narratives. That infrastructure, which I had not fully recognized as infrastructure until it was removed, was simply gone. What surprised me was how much of my life came back. I had not understood, before that dinner, how much cognitive space had been occupied by the management task, by the low-level, always running process of knowing Delia's current story and holding it coherently against what I knew to be true and being ready to confirm or redirect or stay quiet depending on who was asking and what was at stake. When that process stopped, something opened up. Not dramatically, just incrementally, in the way that a room feels larger when you remove furniture you had stopped noticing was there. I started going to the Thursday evening talks at the library, public lectures on local history that I had been meaning to attend for 2 years, but had always been too drained by Friday to have prepared for Thursday. I started calling Marin more often, not because anything was wrong, but because something was right, and I wanted to spend time in it. I went to a watercolor class in November, which I had agreed to attend with Findryden largely because she had signed us both up and told me she was not accepting my excuses, and which I discovered, to my surprise, that I was not terrible at. In December, Delia called on a Saturday afternoon and asked if I would come to her daughter Cassie's winter recital in January. Cassie is a violinist, 22 years old, with Delia's coloring and my father's stubbornness, and she is the best person in our family who is not my own daughter. I said yes, not as a gesture of reconciliation, just because I wanted to hear Cassie play. The recital was on a Saturday in January. I arrived alone, found a seat 3 rows back, and watched my niece stand on a small stage in a black dress and play for 22 minutes from memory. She played beautifully. When she finished, I clapped until my palms were sore. Delia sat down next to me during the intermission. She put a cup of tea in my hand. She had gotten 2 from the table by the door, and we sat side by side watching the other performers for 20 minutes without saying very much. At some point she said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about covering." I said, "Which part?" She said, "The part about needing me to need you." I waited. She said, "I think I knew. Not clearly. But I knew you'd always come through, and I think somewhere I knew it wasn't entirely for my sake." I said, "No, it was for mine too." She said, "I'm sorry I said you owed me." I said, "I know." She said, "That was the worst thing I said, wasn't it?" "Yes," I said. "That was the worst one." She was quiet. The next performer came on, a teenage boy with a cello and the brave, concentrated expression of someone doing a hard thing in public. We watched him. She said, "Do you think we can?" and then stopped. I said, "I think we can try something different than what we had. I don't know if that's the same as what you're asking."
She thought about that.
She said, "Maybe it's better." I said, "Maybe." We stayed for the rest of the recital. We went together to find Cassie afterward, backstage in the small dressing room that smelled of rosin and old curtains, and I hugged my niece and told her she'd played beautifully, and she said, with the directness of a 22-year-old who had not yet learned to manage her own brightness, "Grandma said you might not come. I'm glad you did." I said, "I wouldn't have missed it." Delia was standing just behind me. I did not look at her face when I said it, but I felt her there. 40 years. That is a long time to hold a container for someone else's version of reality. It is also a long time to mistake the holding for love. I think about that now, about the difference between loyalty and collusion, between protecting someone and protecting a lie that protects them. The line between those two things is not always clear at 19. It is clearer at 63. It was not until Delia said "you owe me" that I finally saw the difference from the outside. That was the sentence that broke the spell. Not because she was wrong exactly, there was a kind of logic to it inside the system we had built together, but because it named what I had been trained never to name. Here is what I know now on the other side of that September dinner. The loyalty that requires you to say untrue things is not loyalty. It is a debt arrangement wearing loyalty's clothes. You do not owe anyone the management of their reputation. Not your sister. Not your mother. Not anyone you love. You can love them fully, and still let the truth be what it is. The things we cover up do not disappear. They shift. They move into the next conversation, the next family dinner, the next generation. They live in the family record until someone decides to stop carrying them. When you have been the person who keeps the peace for a long time, stopping feels like destruction. It isn't. It's a door. And on the other side of it is a room where you get to be exactly as honest as you actually are. I was 62 years old the first time in my life that I answered a direct question at a family table with the actual truth. 3 words. I don't know. The sky did not fall. The family did not break. My sister and I are still in contact. She played violin beautifully at Cassie's recital, and I drove home in the dark feeling lighter than I had felt in 40 years. If you have been the keeper of someone else's story, the one who confirms, who redirects, who manages the gap between what happened and what gets said, I want to ask you something before you close this. Not, was it worth it? That question has no useful answer. But this one does. What story are you still covering? And what would happen if, just once, you simply said, I don't know?